Prince George had reportedly learned something about his sister, Princess Charlotte, that left him deeply emotional. At first, the claim appeared to suggest a private family moment, something serious enough to bring the future king to tears. Royal watchers immediately began asking what could possibly have happened between the eldest son and only daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. What was the devastating truth George had supposedly discovered? Was Charlotte facing a major change in her future? Had George learned something about the different lives that could await him and his sister? Or was the dramatic story hiding an even deeper question about what it means to grow up inside the royal family? Because George and Charlotte are not simply brother and sister. They are two children growing up under extraordinary circumstances, with their futures already shaped, at least in part, by the British line of succession. And that is where this story becomes far more emotional than the headline first suggests. But before going any further, one crucial detail must be addressed. The information provided does not establish a verified event in which Prince George learned a specific devastating truth about Princess Charlotte and was brought to tears. No confirmed private conversation, family crisis, or announcement identifying such a development has been provided. That means the supposed truth cannot simply be invented. There can be no fictional tragedy, no imaginary illness, no secret royal decision, no fabricated private conversation between the children and their parents, and no invented quote placed in the voice of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince William, or Catherine. But the emotional question behind the headline remains incredibly powerful, because there is one truth about George and Charlotte that is already known. Although they are growing up together, their futures may place very different expectations upon them. Prince George is the eldest child of Prince William and Catherine of Princess of Wales. As things stand, he is directly behind his father in the line of succession. If the line of succession continues as expected, George could one day become king. Princess Charlotte follows George in the line of succession. Her future is significant in its own right, but it is not identical to her brother's. And as the children grow older, they will naturally become more aware of what those differences mean. That may be the real emotional mystery at the heart of this story. Imagine two siblings growing up side by side. They share the same parents, they experience the same family events, they grow up in the same extraordinary world, and yet, one day, their paths may lead them toward different responsibilities. For George, the future could involve the crown itself. For Charlotte, the future remains more open. She may eventually carry out major royal duties, she may take on a supporting role within the monarchy, or her adult life may develop in ways that cannot yet be predicted. But unlike George, Charlotte is not currently expected to become monarch unless the line of succession changes. That difference is constitutional, but for two siblings, understanding it may also become deeply personal. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The devastating truth may not need to involve a sudden crisis at all. It could reflect something much quieter, the moment when children begin to understand that growing up does not always mean growing in the same direction. George and Charlotte may always remain brother and sister, but their positions within the royal family could eventually place them under different kinds of pressure. George's future has been discussed since the day he was born. Before he could walk, the world already knew where he stood in the line of succession. Every major stage of his childhood has taken place under public attention, and as he grows older, the expectations surrounding him are likely to become even greater. Charlotte, however, occupies a different and historically interesting position. The rules of royal succession changed before her birth, so that male preference no longer displaced an older sister in favor of a younger brother among those covered by the modern succession rules. That is why Charlotte retained her position ahead of her younger brother, Prince Louis. Her place in the line of succession carries historical significance. But even so, Charlotte's future remains less predetermined than George's, and that could eventually create an emotional contrast between the siblings. George may one day have very little choice about whether the crown becomes part of his life. Charlotte may have greater flexibility in determining what role she wants to play. But that freedom also comes with uncertainty. Who will she become? What responsibilities will she choose? How close will she remain to the center of royal life? And how will her relationship with George change if he eventually becomes king? Those questions remain unanswered, but the public fascination with them is growing. And what happened next in the wider story of the Wales children makes the relationship between George and Charlotte even more intriguing. They are growing up during a period of enormous transition for the monarchy. King Charles represents the current reign. Prince William is preparing for the role that may eventually become his. And George, Charlotte, and Louis represent the generation beyond that. The children are not simply watching history from a distance, they're growing up inside it. Every public appearance becomes part of the record, every milestone attracts attention, and every small glimpse of their sibling relationship can lead to endless discussion. But behind the titles and ceremonies is something much more ordinary. They are still children, they are still learning who they are. And perhaps the greatest challenge facing William and Catherine is ensuring that George, Charlotte, and Louis can build their own identities without being overwhelmed by the roles the world has already imagined for them. For George, that challenge may be particularly intense. One day, he may carry a responsibility unlike almost anything another person his age could imagine. He may have to learn the traditions, constitutional responsibilities, and public expectations associated with the monarchy. Charlotte will have her own journey, but it will not necessarily be the same journey. And one day, George may fully understand something that is difficult to appreciate in childhood. The sister standing beside him today may not always be able to follow exactly the same path tomorrow. That does not mean she will leave his life. It does not mean they will become distant. And it certainly does not mean some hidden family tragedy must occur. But adulthood changes relationships, responsibility changes people, and history shows that the relationship between a monarch and his or her siblings can become enormously important. This is where the story becomes especially interesting. If George eventually becomes king, Charlotte could become one of the few people who remembers him before the responsibility arrived, before the crown, before the constitutional role, before every decision carried historic significance. She will have known him simply as her older brother, and that kind of relationship cannot be created by royal advisors, palace officials, or constitutional tradition. It begins in childhood. Perhaps that is why stories involving George and Charlotte resonate so strongly with the public. People are not simply watching two young royals, they are watching a brother and sister whose relationship may one day become part of a much larger royal story. But there is another truth that George may eventually have to confront. Being close to the throne can change the lives of everyone around the future monarch. George's decisions may one day affect the people closest to him. His responsibilities could limit his freedom. His role could influence how his family is expected to behave. And Charlotte, despite being his sister, may have to navigate her own relationship with an institution centered around her brother. That is not necessarily a tragedy, but it is an extraordinary reality. And perhaps that is the devastating truth people are really searching for. The truth that childhood cannot last forever. The truth that two siblings who grow up sharing everything may eventually face completely different futures. The truth that George may one day wear a crown while Charlotte chooses or is asked to stand beside him in an entirely different role. But that was only the beginning, because William may understand this challenge better than almost anyone. He grew up as the eldest son of the then Prince of Wales. He knew from childhood that his life would follow a path different from that of his younger brother. He experienced the pressures of being the future heir while also trying to grow up as a person with friendships, relationships, and private ambitions. Those experiences could influence how he raises George, Charlotte, and Louis. Of course, every generation is different. The Wales children are growing up in circumstances that are not identical to William's own childhood. But William understands something few parents ever have to consider. How do you raise a future king without allowing the future king to consume the child? And equally important, how do you raise the siblings of a future monarch without making them feel as though their own futures matter less? That may be one of the most significant challenges William and Catherine will ever face as parents. George needs to understand his future, but he also needs to be George. Charlotte needs to understand her unique position, but she also needs the freedom to become Charlotte. And Louis will have his own path as well. The three children may share a family, they may share history, but they will not necessarily share the same destiny, and this is where the emotional tension becomes impossible to ignore. What happens when George realizes that his sister may one day have choices he does not? What happens when Charlotte realizes that her brother's future may place him under pressures she can only partly understand? Could George ever feel sad about the burden awaiting him? Could Charlotte become one of his strongest supporters? Could their different paths actually bring them closer? No one can know yet.
And that uncertainty may be the most compelling part of their story. Because unlike a fictional royal crisis, this story is already unfolding in real time. The children are growing older, their personalities will develop, their interests will change, their public roles, if any, will gradually become clearer. And one day, George and Charlotte may look back at their childhood and realize that the world was watching long before they understood why. The detail that follows is what makes the story even more emotional. George may one day become one of the most recognizable figures on the planet. He may carry responsibilities that define an entire era of British history. But when that moment comes, Charlotte may remain one of the people closest to the person behind the title. And perhaps that relationship will be more important than anyone currently understands. Royal history often focuses on the monarch, the king, the queen, the heir. But the people surrounding the monarch can shape the entire course of a reign. Siblings can become advisors, supporters, confidants, or simply the family members who provide a connection to life outside official duty. Charlotte's future role has not been written, but her relationship with George already exists, and that relationship may become increasingly significant as they enter adulthood. Behind the dramatic headline, then, is a much more human story. A brother and sister are growing up. One may one day become king. The other may have a future that is less clearly defined, but no less important. They will face different expectations. They may make different choices. Their lives could eventually take them in directions nobody can predict. But the bond formed before those choices arrive could remain one of the most important parts of their lives. And perhaps that is why the idea of George being brought to tears feels emotionally powerful. Not because there is evidence of a hidden tragedy involving Charlotte, there is not enough source information here to establish one,
But because there may come a moment in every family when children realize that growing up means accepting change. George and Charlotte may always be close, but they cannot remain exactly as they are today. The future is coming, responsibility is coming, and for George, the crown itself may one day become unavoidable. What happens to the sibling relationship when one person becomes king? History offers many different answers. Some royal siblings have remained extraordinarily close. Others have struggled under the pressure of unequal expectations. The future of George and Charlotte's relationship cannot be predicted from the past, but William and Catherine's approach as parents may play a crucial role. they have the opportunity to help their children build strong relationships before the weight of royal responsibility becomes greater. They can encourage individual interests, they can create as much normality as their circumstances allow, and they can remind their children that titles do not erase family. Perhaps that will be one of the most important lessons George ever learns. One day, he may be called king, but before that, he is a son, a brother, and eventually, perhaps, a father himself. The people around him will help shape the person he becomes, and Charlotte will always be part of that story. So what was the devastating truth that supposedly left Prince George in tears? Based on the information provided, no specific private revelation or crisis has been verified. There is no confirmed tragedy to reveal, no authentic family announcement, no documented event proving that George learned something shocking about Charlotte. But there is a truth that cannot be avoided. George and Charlotte's futures are unlikely to be identical. One day, George may carry the crown. Charlotte may stand beside him, support him, build her own life, or create a role that belongs entirely to her. The future remains open, and perhaps the most emotional part of this story is that neither of them can stop time. They are growing up, the world is watching, and the childhood they share today will eventually become the foundation of lives filled with very different responsibilities. One day, Prince George may stand before Britain in a role that history has been preparing him for since birth, and when that moment arrives, Princess Charlotte may still remember the brother who existed long before the crown, the brother who grew up beside her, the brother who shared the same parents, the same home, and the same childhood memories. And perhaps George will look at Charlotte and understand something even more important. A king may carry a nation on his shoulders, but even a king may need his sister. The real question is not whether a hidden tragedy will separate them. It is whether the extraordinary future waiting for George and the uncertain path ahead for Charlotte will ultimately pull them apart or bring them closer than anyone could have imagined.
But there is another dimension to George and Charlotte's story that becomes more significant with every passing year. As they grow older, the world will inevitably begin to compare them, not because William and Catherine necessarily want that comparison, but because royal history has always encouraged it. Who is more prepared for public duty? Who appears more comfortable in front of the cameras? Who seems most interested in following the traditions of the royal family? And perhaps most importantly, how will their different positions in the line of succession shape the lives they eventually choose? For George, those questions may become increasingly difficult to escape. His future is tied to an institution that existed long before he was born. There will be expectations placed upon him that no ordinary child can fully understand. As he gets older, he may gradually receive more preparation for the role that could one day become his. Charlotte, however, may experience that process differently. She is close enough to the future of the monarchy to understand its demands, but her path is not as clearly mapped as George's, and that difference could one day become impossible for both siblings to ignore. Imagine the moment when George fully understands that one day the decisions he makes may affect not only himself, but also his sister. Imagine Charlotte realizing that her brother's future role could transform the structure of their entire family. Their relationship may remain the same at its heart. They will always share the same childhood memories, but the circumstances around them may change dramatically. And this is where the story becomes even more emotional, because being the sibling of a future king is a role that comes without a clear instruction manual. Charlotte may eventually have opportunities George cannot have. She may enjoy greater personal freedom. She may have more choice over the direction of her life. But she may also face questions that George will never have to answer in the same way. How close should she remain to royal life? Should she take on official responsibilities? Should she build a career outside the traditional royal structure?
Will the monarchy of the future even expect the same things from royal siblings that it once did? These are questions that may not have answers for many years, but George could one day understand that his sister's future is not something he can control. And perhaps that is one of the most emotional truths of all. No matter how close two siblings are, they eventually become their own people. George cannot choose Charlotte's future for her. Charlotte cannot carry the responsibilities waiting for George. They may support one another, but they cannot live each other's lives. And for a family as closely watched as the Wales family, that reality may become even more complicated. Because every decision could become a public discussion. If George begins taking on more responsibility, people will watch. If Charlotte chooses a different path, people will speculate. If the siblings appear especially close, it will become a headline. If they spend less time appearing together as adults, some may immediately question whether there is a problem. That is the pressure of living in public, and Prince William understands that pressure better than most. He has spent his entire life being observed. He knows how quickly a photograph can be given a meaning it never had. He knows how private family relationships can become the subject of public speculation. And that experience may influence the way he prepares George and Charlotte for the years ahead. Perhaps William's greatest challenge will not simply be teaching George how to become a future king. It may be making sure George understands what it means to remain a brother while carrying that responsibility. Because history can remember George as a monarch, but Charlotte will remember him as her brother first. That distinction could become incredibly important. And what happened next in the broader story of royal succession reveals why. The monarchy is built around hierarchy. There is always an order, a line of succession, a clear constitutional structure. But family relationships do not operate according to constitutional charts. A sister does not love her brother because of his position. A brother does not stop caring about his sister because one day he may wear a crown. And perhaps the greatest challenge facing the future royal generation will be preventing the structure of the monarchy from overwhelming the relationships that existed before adulthood. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, the years ahead may gradually bring more responsibility. Their childhood appearances may become more formal. Their interests may begin to shape their public identities. And eventually, each of them may have to decide what relationship they want with the institutions surrounding their family. But the choices they make could be influenced by the relationships they build now. That is why George and Charlotte's bond could become one of the most important stories of the next royal generation. Not because every brother and sister relationship must become dramatic, but because the circumstances surrounding them are extraordinary. One day, George could become the most important constitutional figure in the country, and Charlotte could be one of the few people who remembers exactly who he was before any of that happened. She could remember the childhood version of George, the brother before the speeches, the ceremonies, the constitutional responsibilities, the endless attention. And when the world sees a king, she may still see the person she grew up with. That kind of connection can be priceless.
The pressures surrounding George's future could make their relationship more complicated. As George grows older, his schedule and responsibilities may become increasingly different from Charlotte's. He may be expected to prepare for events she does not attend. He may receive certain briefings and responsibilities connected directly to his future position. Charlotte may have her own commitments and ambitions. Their lives may gradually become more separate. That is a normal part of growing up. But for royal siblings, even normal changes can become major public stories. And this is where George's supposed tears take on another meaning. Perhaps the emotional power behind the headline comes from the fear of losing something that has always been there: childhood, family closeness, the simplicity of being brother and sister.
There may come a time when George looks back and realizes that the days when he and Charlotte could simply be children together have passed, not because of a tragedy, not because of a devastating secret, but because life has moved forward. And sometimes that realization can be emotional enough on its own. The truth is that royal children grow up in two worlds at the same time. One world is private. It contains family routines, school, friendships, and ordinary moments. The other is public. It contains tradition, expectation, and a future that millions of people feel entitled to discuss. For George, the second world may become increasingly difficult to avoid. For Charlotte, it may create a different kind of challenge. She may always be connected to the monarchy, but she may have more opportunity to decide exactly what that connection looks like, and that difference could one day become a major source of conversation between the siblings. Not necessarily conflict, not necessarily sadness, but understanding. George may one day understand that Charlotte has choices he may never fully have, and Charlotte may understand that George carries a burden she will never have to experience in exactly the same way. Perhaps that realization will bring them closer. Perhaps it will help them appreciate each other's lives in a way that few people around them can, because even though their futures may be different, they are among the only people who truly understand what it means to grow up inside this particular family. And then comes another important question. What role will Catherine play in helping Charlotte understand her future? Catherine did not grow up as a royal. She entered the royal family as an adult and gradually became one of its most important figures. That gives her a perspective different from someone born into the institution. She understands the demands of royal life, but she also remembers life before it. And as Charlotte grows older, that perspective could become particularly valuable. Charlotte may have questions about public life that Catherine understands from a unique position. How do you maintain your identity? How do you handle public scrutiny? How do you remain connected to family when millions of people have opinions about your life? Those are questions that Catherine herself has had to navigate. And William brings another perspective entirely. He knows what it means to be born into the future of the monarchy. Together, William and Catherine may provide George and Charlotte with two different kinds of guidance. One understands the institution from birth. The other understands what it means to enter that institution and adapt to it. That combination could prove essential. But as the children grow older, there is something their parents cannot control. Eventually, George, Charlotte, and Louis will make their own choices, and those choices may shape the monarchy for generations. This is where the story takes another unexpected turn. The future may not depend only on whether George becomes king. It may also depend on what kind of support system exists around him. A monarch may stand alone in a constitutional sense, but no person lives alone. The people closest to a future king can influence his confidence, his perspective, and his understanding of the world. And Charlotte could eventually become one of those people, not because tradition automatically assigns her that role, but because family relationships can become more powerful than official titles. If George faces an extraordinary moment of pressure one day, Charlotte may understand him in a way few advisors can. She may know the person behind the public image. She may know his strengths and weaknesses from a lifetime of shared experiences. And George may also understand Charlotte in the same way. That could make their relationship a source of strength. But only time will tell. And that uncertainty is what makes the story of these two young royals so fascinating. The world can predict George's constitutional future more easily than it can predict Charlotte's personal future, but no one can predict the relationship they will have 20 or 30 years from now. Will they become close adult siblings? Will Charlotte take on a prominent role beside her brother? Will she create an independent life away from the center of royal duty? Will George depend on her sister's advice?
Or will their futures take them in completely unexpected directions? Right now, nobody knows, and perhaps that is exactly how it should be.
Charlotte is still growing up. Her future should not be decided by speculation. Her identity should not be reduced to the question of what role she might play for George one day. She is an individual, just as George is more than the future role that awaits him. And maybe that is the lesson both siblings will have to learn. Titles can describe their constitutional positions, but they cannot fully describe who they are. George is not only a future king. Charlotte is not only a future royal sister. They are children becoming individuals, and the people they become may matter far more than the labels placed upon them today. Yet there is still one final layer to this story. A day may come when George has to leave behind the relative freedom of childhood completely and step into a role from which there is no easy escape. If he becomes king, the transition will not simply change his life, it could change the lives of everyone closest to him. Charlotte may watch her brother take on responsibilities that transform his daily existence. The person she grew up with could suddenly become the center of an institution watched by the entire world. And perhaps George may one day look at his sister and feel the weight of what that means. Not because he is losing her, but because their relationship will have to adapt. The brother and sister who grew up together may eventually stand in a completely different world, one as monarch, one as his sister. And yet, behind the titles, they may still carry the same memories. That is why the future relationship between George and Charlotte could be so important. The monarchy will eventually have advisors, officials, and institutions, but those things cannot replace the people who knew George before the responsibility arrived. Charlotte could be part of the emotional foundation that keeps him connected to the person he was before becoming the person history expects him to be. And perhaps George could offer Charlotte something equally important, a sense of family that exists beyond public expectations. Because Charlotte, too, will face enormous attention. Her choices will be analyzed, her relationships will be discussed, her future will be predicted by people who know almost nothing about her private hopes or ambitions. Having a brother who understands that pressure may become invaluable. And maybe that is the real emotional truth hidden behind this dramatic story. Not that George learned a shocking secret, not that Charlotte is facing an invented tragedy, but that both siblings may eventually discover something far more difficult. They cannot protect each other from the future. George cannot remove the public attention surrounding Charlotte. Charlotte cannot remove the responsibility waiting for George. All they can do is remain connected while their lives change around them. And perhaps that is why the idea of George becoming emotional is so powerful. Even a future king may one day wish he could stop time. He may wish childhood could last longer. He may wish that the people closest to him could remain exactly as they were before responsibility changed everything. But life does not work that way. Charlotte will grow, George will grow, Louis will grow. Their childhood will become memory, and eventually the future that now feels distant will begin arriving one responsibility at a time. For George, that could mean greater public duties. For Charlotte, it could mean deciding what place she wants within the changing monarchy. For both of them, it may mean discovering whether the bond they formed as children can survive the extraordinary pressures waiting ahead. And perhaps one day Britain will see Prince George standing before the nation in a role he has prepared for his entire life. The world may see a king. The history books may see another chapter in the monarchy. But somewhere nearby could stand the sister who knew him before any of it happened, Princess Charlotte, the girl who grew up beside him before the responsibilities became overwhelming, the sister who shared the years nobody can ever give back.
And if George ever does carry the weight of the crown, perhaps the most important people around him will not be those chosen by title or tradition. Perhaps they will be the people who were there from the beginning: his family, his brother, his sister. And that leaves us with one final question. As Prince George and Princess Charlotte grow older and their lives begin to move toward very different futures, will the destiny waiting for them create distance between brother and sister? Or will the extraordinary world they were born into become the very reason they remain closer than anyone ever expected? Because long after the headlines disappear and the childhood photographs become history, one thing may matter more than crowns, titles, or succession: whether through every change still to come, Prince George and Princess Charlotte can remain what they were before the world began defining their future: brother and sister.